So you're very welcome, John, and thanks again for taking the trouble to travel and come over, and it's great to see you. Maybe before we get on to the, it's fair to say neither of us are quite sure how the difficult doctors thing is going to go. But
Absolutely.
We'll call it a fascinating topic anyway. But before we go there, can I chat to you a bit about narrative medicine, if that's okay? And I've noticed that you write about narrative-based practice, and I'm kind of wondering, is that the same as narrative medicine, or how are they related?
Sure. Well, thank you, Muiris. To start by saying, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for including me in this amazing event. I think I'd like to answer your question by giving a bit of history as context, really, that in the last half of the last century, a lot of fields of study, social sciences, philosophy, etc., were affected by what's often called the narrative turn. And it was a move away from trying to get to the bottom of things, trying to get underneath things, what's really going on here, to asking a very different kind of question, which is, how is this story being told? How is the world being described? The idea that we create reality through the stories we tell. And classically, the philosopher Charles Taylor said, we understand ourselves inescapably in stories. And the psychologist Jerome Bruner wrote, to live in a culture is to be in a set of interconnecting stories. So this was profoundly influential in all kinds of fields, and inevitably it influenced medicine around the 1980s with works like Catherine Montgomery Hunter's Doctor's Stories and Arthur Kleinman, The Illness Narratives, and lots of other books of that kind. And the turning point for me, and I think for many people, when narrative-based medicine, narrative medicine coalesced into a thing, it was the book edited by Trish Greenhalgh and Brian Hurwitz, two professors of general practice, in 1998, and I contributed a chapter to that, and they called that narrative-based medicine. And the reason Trish and Brian chose that title was as a counterpoise to evidence-based medicine. Evidence-based medicine was on an irresistible rise at the time, and they wanted to counterpose it, not to oppose now evidence-based medicine, but to say we really needed something to balance it. So they call it narrative-based medicine, and that was when I got involved in the whole movement. A few years later, Rita Sharon at Columbia University in New York wrote a book called Narrative Medicine, in which she described particularly the approach that she was taking in her teaching at Columbia, which was rather more focused on literary theory and phenomenology and the way they might inform medicine. And she's continued very much with that line of teaching. Personally, I don't make a difference. I don't make a distinction between narrative-based practice and narrative-based medicine and narrative medicine. I think that's too confusing. But I do make a distinction with narrative-based practice, which has always been my interest, which is how do you apply these storytelling ideas to the consultation, to the interaction with colleagues, to real conversations, rather than research or other modes of applying narrative medicine.
I think it's fair to say you've also been very cognizant and have taken into account not the limitations of the consultation, but there are sort of it has to be practical.
Absolutely. It has to be both narrative and normative.
Yes.
By normative, I mean the norms of medical practice.
Yes.
You can't get struck off. You can't kill the patient. I mean, there are certain absolute, there are real limits. Death is not a story. Deprivation is not a story. Disability is not a story. But somehow you have to merge the two.
Sure. Yeah. Fascinating. Close reading is considered a valuable step in the learning curve to attentive listening in narrative-based medicine. I'm curious, how do you see the link between those two skills?
I think it's a matter of applying to real, everyday, clinical and educational conversations the same kind of attentiveness that you would apply to poetry, as we heard just this morning before the break, and to a good short story. It's being able to listen to the subtleties, the nuances, hear what is being spoken or implied in the silences, all those things, being able to take conversations as seriously as we take literature.
Okay. I've a particular point on a particular interest in trying to sometimes quote the actual words the patients use in their
Yes.
clinical notes. But I reckon it's quite a challenge for a lot of us a lot of the time, and I'm just wondering, why do you think we're generally not great at doing that?
Well, let me say first of all, there's a wonderful book by a Norwegian academic called Peter Azerstad, and it's called The Patient as Text. And he looks at patients' notes down a century, actually, and he looks at the way that essentially doctors colonize patients' stories by rewriting them in their own image. And so, for example, a patient who has described a religious belief will be described in the early 20th century as devout, whereas they might be described in the early 21st century as eccentric. And the doctor's narrative captures that. It's basically a description of the doctor's view, the doctor's construction of what he or she hears, rather than the actual words that came out of the patient's mouth. And it's an incredible discipline, actually, to try and write down, instead of tired all the time, you know, which we write as shorthand, TATT sometimes, to actually write in quotation marks, I don't understand why I'm feeling so fatigued, which is what the actual words the patient said. And I don't understand is the crucial bit. Because, well, what don't you understand about it? It's following the bit of the utterance that we don't normally hear.
I think it's great as well when you're doing a follow-up consultation to have that as a guide. It often opens it up kind of naturally the next time as well. But it's fascinating, the entire thing. What about the notion that, and I get this a bit when I talk about narrative-based medicine, the notion that in your attempt to carry out those kind of consultations, some doctors feel the time needed to run them is too long. I'm just wondering, what would you say to the ones that say it's not compatible with the 10 or 15-minute consultation, or whatever?
We hear that response all the time, inevitably. I've been running courses now for around 25 years in what we call conversations inviting change, which is the application of narrative ideas and skills to the consultation. And what we find from participants on those courses when we see them later is they virtually all say that to start with it makes their consultations longer, but in the long run it makes them shorter. And the reason is they become more focused. They hear those little cue words that actually make it possible to go straight away to what the patient's greatest concern is. I mean, I often tell this story, and it's in my book, of a patient who came in and said to me, "I've got 3 things, doctor." And I said, "What's the 4th?" And she told me, and it was, you know, patently the thing she really wanted to talk about. We never got to the 3 things. I never discovered what they were. And it's that kind of focusing on the conversation as about language and about stories, not about, you know, digging down, finding the diagnosis, finding the formulation. And it's training people to do that actually makes it much quicker. And to be able to ask questions like, look, we only have a relatively short time. If I only focused on one of those things, what would it be? I mean, this will be bread and butter to a lot of the practitioners in the audience.
Makes me think, is the classic door handle, you know, consultation or addition at the end of a consultation, is that the patient attempting to get to the 4th point?
It may be a sign.
Despite us.
It may be a sign that the conversation wasn't what they wanted. And it's made me think maybe we should say to patients, you know, if you're on your way out and you had your hand on the door handle, what would you be telling me?
Now, there's a good one. Let's try that.
Maybe people could try that out.
Yeah, that'd be good. I like that. In the most recent book, you write a piece which is titled "Against Diagnosis," and there's been a book published recently in the UK, talked about the imaginary patient and was questioning the whole diagnosis thing. But you conclude that, as a rule of thumb, avoid them when you can, this is diagnosis, be humbler about them when you cannot, and seek permission from their rightful owners whenever possible. And I'm curious to know, how much does that view emanate from your practice of narrative-based medicine?
Okay, well, let me respond first with a bit of an advertisement. It's actually the last essay in a book I've just published called Reflective Practice in Medicine, which is subsequent to this one. So I've managed to get in that commercial. But having said that, I think that diagnosis has become a bit of a fetish in medicine. That's not to say, we can do without it. If somebody comes to see me and says, is this a bunion? I'm going to say, yes. What do I need? You need to see a podiatrist. I mean, that is all fairly straightforward. But I think a huge number of consultations that we have assume a diagnosis is necessary when it may not only be unnecessary, it may be stigmatizing, it may be harmful, it may kind of concretize, reify their problem in a way that they don't find useful. I have tended to use formulations like, have you ever thought of this as depression? And how useful might it be for you to think of this as depression? Or even, has anybody called this asthma before? Have you thought it might be asthma? If I told you that most doctors would regard it as asthma, how helpful would that be? How alarmed? It's using the language to work in rather than assuming that you've got to slap something straight on.
And it allows negotiation and invites
and it's opening a conversation rather than foreclosing it.
Okay. I'd love to keep going on narrative, but we dug a hole for ourselves, I think.
We certainly have. Well, to be specific, you dug a hole.
Yeah, I did. I won't point my finger at anyone else in the audience.
Yes. You dug a hole and I jumped straight into it.
Yeah, no, you were very good. No, I won't say where we started. Let's work our way up to that. So, difficult doctors. In whose eyes are doctors difficult? Is it the eyes of their peers, or is it in the eyes of their patients?
Well, I think I should first say that there is rarely such a thing as a essentially, quintessentially difficult doctor any more than a difficult patient. I mean, we've moved away from talking about difficult patients, heart sink patients, all those terribly stigmatizing words. And I think possibly we should do so in relation to difficult doctors as well.
You're very kind, aren't you?
I'm feeling kind at the moment in front of several hundred
Okay.
people who might themselves be difficult doctors.
Indeed,
but I think we need to start from a position that I've been a difficult doctor myself. I'm sure you at times have been a difficult doctor. I hope that nobody, no medics in the audience will put their hands on their heart and say they've never been a difficult doctor. Having said that, it is undoubtedly the case that very many patients find doctors difficult as a species. Okay. They find us difficult because we don't listen to them. They find us difficult because we foreclose on them. They find us difficult because we rush to conclusions. We get things wrong and we don't apologize for it. And the rest. I mean, you only have to listen to conversations at bus stops or on the train or from your family and friends anywhere to accept that as a profession we are not seen as an easy and helpful lot for a lot of the time. That's not to say people don't have wonderful stories about doctors who save their lives, but there are a lot of narratives out there about how difficult we are, and I think we have to take them seriously.
Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, everyone is difficult with certain people some of the time, okay, put it that way. And I suppose, is there any help in understanding why doctors might be difficult in trying to understand what triggers that?
Well, I think there are a number of background factors. Number one is that we are institutionally trained not to listen. At medical school and thereafter, we are taught to listen in a highly selective way to the normative rather than the narrative. somebody's telling a story which to them is rich with meaning about their family context and their work context. And we're listening for words like blood and pain. And we just latch on to those. That's our form of listening. And I think that makes us difficult. A beloved friend and colleague of mine who sadly died a couple of years ago used to describe my work as remedial therapy for selective brain damage. So we're talking about helping doctors to unlearn behaving in a difficult way. I think the second factor is in the UK, I'm sure in Ireland, many other places, doctors are working with scant and shrinking resources. They are experiencing a great deal of moral distress, and they don't have either the training or support to recognize always that is not the patient's problem. That's my problem. And I have to get whatever help I can to deal with it. And if I can't deal with it, maybe I shouldn't be seeing patients today or next week. That's a counsel of perfection, I know. So it's the cascading of moral distress to patients. But I think there is also a historical and systemic element, which is that every doctor has been taught by role models who've behaved badly. Some of us have rebelled against that, hopefully. Some have absorbed it and behave badly themselves. You know that wonderful Philip Larkin poem, They Fucked Me Up, My Mum and Dad, and it goes on, but they were fucked up in their turn. And then later on it says, it deepens like an ocean shelf. Well, I think we have that kind of ocean shelf in medicine.
I mean, on the other hand, are we a bit too hard on ourselves? I mean, which of us hasn't, the syndrome halt, hungry, angry, late and tired? I mean, are you being difficult if you feel that?
No, but it may explain your difficult behavior and it may enable you to get help with your difficult behavior. A colleague of mine ran a service for many years for doctors with mental health difficulties, and he identified an enormous level of being driven, not surprisingly, of being self-critical, self-judgmental among them, and of presenteeism, of turning up for work when sick, for turning up for work when patently, not fit for it.
Gosh. So, what about doctors themselves? Doctors ourselves? Do we find ourselves difficult?
Are you asking personally or?
Okay, we'll broaden it out. If it is the case, might that be a kind of us pre-selecting, self-selection to
I think, well, we are pre-selected clearly by intelligence in the formal sense, clearly by achievement in the formal sense, thinking of the high school grades needed to get into medical school. There's evidence, as I said, that we are driven, we are judgmental and self-judgmental, and I guess that invites the other side of an approach to doctors being difficult, which is compassion and self-compassion, of accepting one's limitations, accepting one's failings, and being forgiving and compassionate to the failings of colleagues, although not necessarily asking that patients should do that. That's not their job.
No.
We're paid to deal with it. They're not.
Okay, fair enough. You have a personal story about a consultant that you went to see as a patient, and you reckon they were being difficult. Do you want to share that with us?
I'll talk briefly about a consultant who was difficult, and then I'll talk about somebody who was incredibly helpful to counterbalance it, so it doesn't become too negative. The consultant who I used to see who was difficult used to bombard me with research findings about the particular condition I was suffering from. And I didn't want it, and I didn't need it. I wanted him to listen to me, and he thought because I'm a colleague, I guess he would flatter me, or I would find it useful for him to tell me the latest, randomized controlled trial from Minnesota, I wasn't the tiniest bit interested.
No.
If I had been, I could have looked it up myself on the internet. And it filled all the available space without him actually noticing that I was worried about things that had nothing to do with the RCT from Minnesota. So it was that kind of difficulty.
Sure.
That's a quite specific thing. The consultant who was actually wonderful, and she saved my life. I was getting short of breath over a period of time, and I saw, a number of doctors who diagnosed everything from kind of mild asthma to hysteria, as you can imagine. And I then saw a chest physician at a teaching hospital, and she was also very reassuring and saying absolutely nothing serious, you really don't need to worry. And then I said, look, you'll think I'm a complete hypochondriac, but my mother died from a pulmonary embolus, and obviously I'm scared that that's what I've got too. And she said, would you be reassured to have a scan? And I said, actually, yes, please. And she did one, and later that afternoon she came back and said, you're a very good diagnostician. And I had lost 25% of my lung volume to pulmonary emboli, and it was her willingness to be led by me rather than just pat me on the hand and say, there, every doctor is scared they've got the worst possible diagnosis.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad you got a bit of balance there, for the sake of the audience. I'm curious, is there any way we can make it easier for doctors to be less difficult, or maybe to be seen to be less difficult?
Yes. I ran a service for many years at Health Education England. Actually, it started when it was the London Deanery, then became Health Education England, which was, it started out as a service for observation of clinical teaching. So we went in and we watched doctors teach, for example, on ward rounds or in clinics. In some cases where they were excellent and we wanted to develop them further, it was a form of faculty development. But in some cases where they had been identified as bullying by their juniors. And that then developed into a mentoring service for doctors who had been subject to accusations of bullying. And we took with them a kind of two-track process that we would see them for mentoring on the understanding that seeing us would not indemnify them from any procedures that their employers wanted to take. So, for example, their human relations department at their trust might well be taking them through disciplinary procedures. And we would say, having mentoring won't protect you from that. And equally, the HR department would say, look, we won't ask for any information about what you say on the mentoring side. We have to pursue this, inquiry as it is, and any disciplinary that might be necessary. So that kind of two-track approach, if you like, the I don't know what you call it, the iron fist in the whatever, a mixture of a soft cop and hard cop, basically, we found very useful.
And it worked, yeah.
And it worked.
Yeah.
It worked.
Okay, interesting. In your previous book, How Not to Be a Doctor, you write about the art of not listening.
Yes.
And as someone who's obviously in favor of narrative-based medicine, I found that just amazingly counterintuitive. So I'm confused. What are you on about there?
It's good to be confused. I learnt the idea from one of my mentors, who was a clinical psychologist and family therapist called David Campbell, and he had an extraordinary talent for asking the most focused and pertinent question at the best possible moment. And as a group, we were his family therapy trainees, and we said to him, David, how on earth do you do it? And he said, I tune out for much of the time. And we obviously asked him to elaborate because, we thought it was counterintuitive. It was so much the opposite of what we expected this sort of brilliantly attentive man to say. And he said, because I if it's noise, or if it's sort of there to try and distract me or take me away from what has most weight, what has most emotional weight, I kind of don't listen to it. And I listen out for the hesitancies, I listen out for all the signals that something is about to be said but not quite being said. Something is waiting to be thought but not quite yet being thought. In other words, for emergence. So he was managing to listen out for emergence rather than further surface.
Okay. I mean, you now practice that, presumably, and
I try to.
yeah, sure, but I'm just wondering, I mean, the first time or the first 10 or 20 times you do it, you must be scared that you're going to miss something.
Yes, and I think it's that normative narrative distinction again. You have to be ready to move from the normative to the narrative and back again, you know, in a millisecond.
Okay.
I sometimes I talk about, you know, digging holes and weaving tapestries. You know, you need to be able to dig a hole at 1 minute and then move to weaving a tapestry at the next minute. Digging the hole is the diagnosis, the formulation. Weaving the tapestry is creating something that is unexpected and emergent. Another metaphor I use is dumpling soup. You know, if it doesn't have enough dumplings in it of facts and science, it's not a dumpling soup.
Okay.
But if it doesn't have enough liquid, fluidity, it's not a dumpling soup either. So
like that.
what is the right kind of dumpling soup for each conversation?
Wow. I really like
It's
that
a
imagery.
metaphor that works in every single country, incidentally, because everyone has their dumpling soup, their version of dumpling soup.
Right.
Yeah.
And you have to get it right. Interesting. Again, it's going slightly left field, but I'm prompted by the book to ask, can doctors be capable but insane?
Yes. I think that refers to a particular essay I wrote on a very famous German legal case about a judge called Judge Schreber, who was patently psychotic, had a whole big delusional system, and was incarcerated in a mental hospital for many years. Freud wrote an important essay about him, and there have been lots of essays about Freud's essay about Judge Schreber since. But essentially, the court, in a very enlightened way, basically said, yes, he's nuts. It's obvious that he's nuts, but he's not incapable. Okay. He can still function normally in respect of almost everything except these bizarre ideas that he has that his psychiatrists are affecting him with beams or all kinds of very mad ideas. So I think there are, I've undoubtedly worked with doctors who were able to contain or compartmentalize areas of their belief that I would consider insane. Maybe I have such areas of beliefs myself, but they were able to function within those constraints.
It'd be very interesting to see how a public would react to that. It makes a lot of sense, but it would be, you know, just wondering how he's mad. Does that mean he's bad?
It would be very interesting to know how the public could react if they always knew what you or I were thinking while we were seeing them.
Sure.
I guess.
At least a change of medical career. Fair enough. I'm kind of wondering, is there really such a thing as a difficult doctor, or is it like, you know, talking about heart-sing patients? So is it really about our own reactions rather than the doctor, him or herself?
Largely yes, but not entirely. I think there are undoubtedly doctors who are so difficult that they should be withdrawn from work. I'm pleased to say that I think over the course of my career that probably happens more than it used to. When I was a junior doctor, I worked for one consultant who was so consistently irrational that we used to hide patients from him. So there was a ward at the end of the hospital, and it was so far away that he could never be bothered on a ward round to reach them. Probably others have stories like this as well. And if we had somebody who was quite precarious and we thought he might make a dangerous decision in relation to them, we would move them to Ward 10. And then we'd move them back after he'd done his twice-weekly ward round. I don't think he would be allowed to practice now, and I think we would be spared from that kind of manoeuvre.
Yeah, gosh.
He's no longer alive, I should say. So
Good,
if there are any lawyers in
no
the
names,
audience
no
thinking,
no, not even the initials and nothing like that. Fair enough. Right, it's time for a confession for us to confess a little bit. I think if you're okay with that for the audience.
Can I leave you alone on the stage for this?
No. You're with me on this one. Sorry. Although I will admit to being the one who went to use it. So we hit upon the title, Why Are Doctors So Difficult? Because we thought our initial phrase or thought, which was, why are doctors assholes? We thought that was too rude. Hope it doesn't make you feel too uncomfortable, but I have to ask, are some doctors literally assholes?
I think there are certainly some doctors who I would describe using that word.
Yes.
And I think there are probably doctors who you would describe using that word. Probably we would be careful about the company in which we spoke that. And I suppose as somebody taking a narrativist view, I would say those are essentially our own constructions of those individuals, and we would probably need to concede that their loved ones and friends might regard them differently. But can I be any more circumspect than I'm already being?
It sounds like a very good moment to head back towards difficult doctors, really, doesn't it?
Yes, but I should share with you, there is somebody I follow on Twitter. He's actually a sociolinguist called Dario Skalazinski, and some people may follow him on Twitter as well. And he is, some would say, outrageously anti-doctor, outrageously provocative towards doctors. He wouldn't say that himself. He would say he's simply trying to bring us down a peg or two and challenge our pomposity. And he ran a hashtag for quite some time, hashtag doctors are dickheads. And you can do a search and you can find out. He got a tremendous following for this. And I've engaged with him, as a number of other doctors have, in, please, you could be just a little bit more constructive. And he said it's the expectation that doctors have for us to be constructive that is part of the problem. Actually, you need to take this because it's what you're paid for. So we get back to that issue of how much abuse should we be able to take because it's what people feel. Okay.
Not a great fan.
Okay, fine. But I just put it out there. People can do a search and find it.
Yeah. Okay, I should really start this with a confession of my own, but have you been a difficult doctor yourself?
Without a doubt.
Any examples?
I've been, like all of us, I can think of a small number of patients within my career whose lives I could have saved and didn't because of error, because of inattention, because of misdiagnosis, which may have had all the aforesaid reasons for it, including, exhaustion, burnouts, etc., etc. I have also had patients tell me to my face I was being difficult. But here again, I have a positive story because I can remember one patient, I'd offered her a suggestion that her problems might be stress-related, and she literally got up, said, "You're a fat lot of use," went out and slammed the door. And she came back 2 or 3 weeks later to say, I've been thinking about what you said. So that happens too.
I'm afraid I have a similar story, but it didn't end as nicely as yours.
Many of mine didn't either,
Yeah.
so, you know.
I mean, in my case, the chair was pushed back, put on the floor, over to the door, slammed the door after me. But we had a communal waiting area for four practices. So she just stood outside my door and said, "Don't bother waiting. He's no fucking good." The rest of that surgery was a little bit difficult.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But
Yeah.
I've also had, I can remember a consultation where I had a medical student sitting in with me where I corpsed, as actors would say. You know, I couldn't think of the next thing to say. We'd got into an adversarial conversation and, you know, my jaw had dropped and I couldn't think of a response. And so I had a medical student observing me in the very shaming position of having forgotten my lines.
Yeah. We've all worked with difficult doctors. Is there any way of describing, is there any common thread of how they've been difficult?
I would use the word mismatch, which I find a very useful word in all kinds of circumstances. I find, you know, sometimes it is a mismatch between that doctor and their colleagues or their team, which may be remediable. You know, it may be that they're the only one marching in step and the rest of the team are marching out of step. It may be a mismatch that is so great with the whole system that actually they effectively cannot work within that system and therefore they need to find or be found a place outside the system. It may be a mismatch that is so enormous in social and cultural terms that actually they can't function as doctors. But I find that kind of, where is the mismatch here? Is it bridgeable? Is it remediable? I find those concepts very helpful. And I found those concepts helpful when we ran a mediation service for teams in difficulty. And it was a very, very helpful idea.
I have this need to think that doctors are less difficult now than they were in the past, but wishful thinking.
I think in some ways, for example, we are more regulated, hence gross negligence, gross misbehavior is more likely to be picked up by a whole variety of systems. In some ways, we may be more difficult, thinking of, you know, Benji's story yesterday about the GP he saw who had his eyes fixed on the computer the whole time. So that whole element of the face-to-face interaction has been lost, and we're dealing with essentially automata or, you know, bionic doctors who have become semi-fused with the technology. And that is more difficult. I can remember handwritten notes on you know, small cards and very minimal notes, so I wasn't drawn into the computer the whole time.
I mean, a lot of us here, unfortunately, will remember seniors who use ritual humiliation of junior doctors or medical students as their modus operandi for bedside teaching. They're basically rude and overbearingly kind of self-confident. Please tell me that they're dying out.
Largely, but not entirely.
No.
I've overheard teaching by humiliation from my bed as a hospital patient. You know, behind a curtain, I've heard trainees being humiliated while seeing the patient on the other side of the curtain. But I think, fortunately, juniors and students are more assertive than they used to be. We ran resilience courses for a while. I know the word resilience has got a very bad press, but as part of our courses, we used to teach assertiveness in the face of bullying, and we used to teach procedures for escalating concerns about bullying. I think those kinds of supports for trainees and juniors are far more common than they used to be.
With your permission, I think we have time, so hopefully there's a few questions out there. So roving mics, and please put your hand up. There's a lady there at about row 6, I think.
And don't worry, we can't see your faces from here, so you could ask anything you like.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could I turn the statement around and say perhaps doctors need to be somewhat difficult to do the job they do?
I think I would reframe that as knowing appropriate boundaries to set to protect ourselves without abusing the patient. Sorry, that's a very serious and intense answer to a very good question. We need to know how to do that and say no, but we also need to know when actually that is dangerous or insulting.
Okay. Anyone else? Someone here? Other female?
Hello.
Okay.
Bapuji Rao from
Sorry.
South Wales.
Yeah.
We have some colleagues, as you know, are very difficult to work with, very annoying, irritating.
Yes.
We all talk about them. But interesting bit is their patients seem to like them very much.
Yeah.
That makes us feel more annoying. Can you explain it?
If I can butt in there and say, apparently Dr. Shipman was
Yes, he was
absolutely
adored.
loved by his patients.
Adored by his patients.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I'm tempted just to let that comment sit there as a comment. I mean, it's part of the tapestry. I don't have an answer.
Sorry, in the middle of about 7 rows back. Hand up, yeah. Thank
Hello,
you.
thank you for a really fascinating talk. I once got told by a consultant that if people are angry at work, it's because they're having problems at home. To what extent do we tolerate, empathize, understand difficult behavior at work because people might be having health problems, burnout, stress, trouble at home? To what extent do we allow that, and at what point does it tip over into just being an asshole?
I think it's commonly, although not always the case, that difficult behaviour comes from domestic difficulties. And certainly when we ran the mentoring service, I can remember uncovering on quite a few occasions, personal and family distress that was behind what the doctor was displaying at work. I think it's a question of our duty to again set a boundary around that, and to be able to say, yes, I do understand, you're going through a divorce, or you have a child who is dangerously ill, or whatever. What do we need to do to help you protect patients from the more negative effects of that? And just to be able to spell out that boundary and actually say, individually we are able to show a very great deal of compassion and leeway to make allowances at work in the way you behave to your colleagues, but we do need to be concerned that doesn't cascade down to patients and their families. How helpful an answer was that? As I spoke it, I wondered if it just sounded a bit woolly. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Down on the, yeah, thank you.
Hello, thanks very much for a great talk. I'm very interested in narrative-based medicine myself. But having been a GP, probably a very difficult one, for 35 years now, I feel that things have improved. And also being a trainer, I really feel that the feminization, and this is going to sound really defensive as well, but the feminization of medicine and the fact that I think women in general don't behave quite as arrogantly. Now, this could be a big, huge general, but I do feel that things have improved an awful lot, perhaps since the time when I was an undergraduate in the 1980s, which dates me. But basically, don't you think that we maybe are being a bit hard on ourselves? And to my mind, patients have become much more difficult.
Okay. I'll give two responses. One in relation to doctors, one in relation to GP training in particular, and then in relation to patients. GP training, I currently have a portfolio career as a writer and educator, and I do still have 4 sessions a week as a GP training program director, unbelievably. And on one of them, they're in different parts of London and the southeast, and in one of them, I now work with a training program director team of 7, in whom the majority are women and the majority are of South Asian or African origin, and it is absolutely wonderful, and it is utterly different from the style of GP training when I trained as a GP. They bring a huge amount, and yes, GP training, certainly in the UK, I know relatively little about Ireland, has utterly transformed over the time that I've been a doctor. In relation to patients, I think it's undoubtedly true that patients have become far more consumerist in their attitudes, and that reflects a whole range of changes in society, including a relentless move towards neoliberal ways of thinking, including the business model entering the medical world, etc., etc. So yes, I think they have become more difficult in the sense of becoming more demanding, and that places, I guess, I'm tempted to call it a learning need on us to respond more in the way that the better kind of commercial enterprises respond to customers. And that's a challenge. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it's irresistible, and it's going to carry on.
Someone down, yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm also very interested in narrative medicine, and I use it in my teaching. And I use it to teach, for example, reflection, if you can teach reflection. And you can see the postgrad students, as soon as you say the word reflection,
Yeah,
they roll their eyes, because it's become this thing that we all have to do. Do you think that if we reflect properly and we reflect critically on ourselves, it makes us less likely to be difficult doctors? Or do you think that doctors that are assholes are just never going to reflect critically, and they're just going to be like Narcissus staring in the lake?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have all sorts of thoughts about that. One is that I think doctors who are members of collaborative reflective groups, I'm thinking obviously of Barlink groups, but more specifically of narrative-based groups that reflect, of which I run a number, and all the other different models, Schwartz rounds, etc., etc. I think these doctors are far less difficult, so I think we need to support them in that way. The other thought I have has escaped me momentarily, but if we've reached the end of the session, maybe it should escape me permanently. But yeah, I'm happy to continue that conversation with you, particularly around, final advertisement, the book I've written on reflective practice in medicine, which addresses some of these issues, including the eye rolling.
I thought we were finished, but I think there's one more if we have time.
Trained as a family doc, and in 10 years or so into my career, switched to coaching. I was taught how to be an executive coach, and the difference in the context of the encounter is absolutely shattering, because in medicine we hold the patient as disease, we hold ourselves as responsible for the diagnosis and the treatment, and in the States there's a whole bunch more issues about liability of that decision. When you free yourself up to hold your client as a coach as capable, and me as holding up a mirror to help them see their own issues and to plan their own exit, I just want to say that it was a totally liberating experience. Absolutely. And much of what we're talking about here is because of the overlying need to diagnose and treat, and the context that we don't mention of the actual clinical encounter and the responsibility we take on our own shoulders. I'm not sure it's avoidable, but it sets up a lot of the dynamic, I think, that we're talking about.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for that. That kind of brings us to a natural end. Thanks for tolerating the topic. I think it was a difficult one for us to put on the program, and yet
Nobody's thrown anything at
no,
us.
no. Yeah, well, you got to watch out. Might be tripped up on the way out.
I've
and all
got
those kind of things.
my eye on that door there.
Okay, fair enough. Look, the good news, you forgive me being funny, is I don't see a need to set up a new group called Assholes Anonymous. So that's my bit of positivity. Listen.
Thank you.
Thanks very much,
Well, thank
John.
you.
You're great to chat to, but I really think
Likewise.
you're great to rise to
Yes.
to
well,
this as a
thank you.
topic, and thank you for doing that.
Well,
and
thank you
for coming
very
over.
much.
Okay,
Thank you.
so hopefully we won't get tripped up on the way out.